moderator. Speaking of our moderator is Arturo Lopez-Levy, who is an assistant professor of international relations and politics at Holy Names University. His research agenda focuses on small states and international relations, as well as asymmetry, and he's an expert on Cuba, Latin America, American politics, and the US role in world affairs. And he's written and presented about these topics for numerous foundations and spaces and media outlets. He's taught dozens of courses in American politics, international relations, comparative politics, and Latin American politics. He's an expert on these themes. So he will be guiding our conversation with the Deputy Foreign Minister this morning. And with that, I will turn it over to Arturo.
So welcome to this session with Deputy Minister Carlos Fernandez de Cossio. This is a great pleasure for me and an honor to lead this conversation. So let me introduce Ambassador Cossio to you. Ambassador Cossio, Deputy Minister of Foreign Relations of the Republic of Cuba, is a seasoned diplomat. He graduated from the Higher Institute of International Relations, Raul Roa, in Havana, and he also has a PhD in political science from the University of Havana. Ambassador Cossio served in Cuban diplomacy in multiple areas, multilateral and bilateral relations. He was an observer, an electoral observer in the first democratic elections in post-apartheid South Africa. Later, he also was ambassador to South Africa in a later period. He was ambassador to Canada, and he was the Cuban head of delegation when Cuba played a very important role as guarantor of the peace negotiation in Colombia. Welcome, Ambassador Cossio, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know how many people are online and how many we're talking to.
We have 18 attendees.
But I welcome you all. As you know, or as many know, my presence in Washington was due to bilateral conversations that we have with the U.S. State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to talk about migration issues. There is a long bilateral relationship on migratory issues between Cuba and the United States that is governed basically by 4 bilateral agreements that we have signed during the years, and that serve to comply with the mutual agreed target of avoiding irregular, insecure, and disorderly migration between the 2 countries. When these agreements are fully implemented, and life showed in 2017 and 2018, when they were implemented and when all parts of it were comprehensively put into place, it showed that we had the capacity to manage irregular flows of migration. In the past few years, that has not been the case. And for 4 years, we did not meet. So it is important for our 2 governments to have sat down, discuss our mutual interpretations of the situation today, to make a diagnosis of what is it that we're facing and which are the steps that needs to be taken so that we can again have the capability of managing irregular flows of migration to meet the targets that we have put in place. That is the reason why we met in this occasion. It is part of our bilateral relationship. Of course, it's not the whole of the relationship. But the context in which we do it is in the context in which there has been a fundamental setback from the steps that we took in 2015 and 2016 to move forward in the inevitable links between Cuba and the United States, in which both governments, in spite of our undeniable discrepancies in some political issues and some ideological issues, we agreed that it was important for both our peoples and that it was in the interest of both nations to move forward in trying to accomplish a better relationship. It was a very incomplete process. It was only the beginning. The main element of the US policy towards Cuba, which is the economic blockade, a very overwhelming set of economic coercive measures, remained in place during that period. But there was the hope and there was a commitment from the US government that eventually it would be lifted. And that was a priority of Cuba. And of course, it was a requirement if we were ever going to truly speak of normalization in our relationship. But since 2018, and most fundamentally since 2019, this process under the government of Donald Trump began a severe process of setbacks. The government set as a goal to exert maximum pressure on Cuba, basically economic pressure. It attempted to isolate Cuba with a total failure. It attempted to discredit Cuba internationally, again, with total failure, but it was successful in putting in place a set of reinforced economic coercive measures that strengthened the blockade and escalated it to a new qualitative dimension, different from the past, which has had a huge impact on the daily lives of Cubans. It has, of course, a great impact on our capacity to manage and develop our economy. And above all, it had a strong impact in the context of the COVID pandemic. Because in addition to the limitations that Cuba and every country encountered to cope with the health requirements and also with the economic requirements in the context of the pandemic, the US chose to reinforce its measures at that moment. The excuses were many, and those excuses are not repeated today by the current government in the White House, but yet the current government, the Democratic government in the White House, that repudiated the policy of Donald Trump, that committed to change it during the campaign, has done nothing to change it. So in practical terms, the policy applied by the US towards Cuba, above all in terms of the economic blockade, which is the most significant element of that relationship, continues in place. So to the people in Cuba, to the daily lives of Cubans today, there's no difference between the policy of the government of Donald Trump and the policy of Joe Biden as president of the United States. That's the reality we face today. To put it in place, the US counts with an overwhelming and very well-financed capacity to create a narrative about Cuba that gives Americans and gives people involved in politics and in policy the idea of a demonized country, of a country where human rights are constantly violated, where people are in despair, a country that is stuck in the past and is not moving, is not transforming, is not looking ahead. And it helps, that narrative, in many occasions built out of Southern Florida, but not only out of Southern Florida. So a lot of it comes out of Washington, helps to build that narrative, confuses people, and people who do not have much time to look at these issues simply capture that narrative and act or don't act informed by what this narrative says. That's the reality we face today bilaterally. We are convinced that Cuba and the United States have many issues to discuss, and there are many areas in which our two countries could cooperate, could engage in spite of our differences. And if the policy of the United States today is not only to punish the people of Cuba, but it's also to become an obstacle in the way of greater links between Cubans and Americans, our aim is to try to go around that and to establish as many links as possible with all sectors and all walks of life in the United States. Among them, of course, with great importance, the people of Cuban origin, either born in Cuba or descendants of Cubans in this country. I would give that as an initial introduction. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador Cossio, we already have two questions that you might address. The first, both of them are by Medea Benjamin. She asks, is there an issue to improve relations where we can get some support from Republicans in Congress? And she also asks, why is Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list of the State Department?
Thank you. I believe there are many issues in which both Democrats and Republicans could get involved in pushing for a better relationship with Cuba. We've done that in the past. Perhaps the level of polarization that exists today in domestic politics in the United States has made that more difficult in recent years. But in the past, it was very common to have in Congress, in the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans involved in the belief that there should be a better relationship between the two countries, even though in many occasions there continue to be discrepancies in some issues, as discrepancies exist with many countries around the world. I'm sure the United States does not have a total identity or view with many countries with which it relates, and some of which are allies of the United States in many parts of the world. Well, I think that between our two countries, there could be a much better relationship, and we can learn from each other, and we could engage with each other. Now, the list of countries that allegedly are sponsors of terrorism is a list of the Department of State. It is not an internationally recognized list. It is not a UN list. It's not a list of a regional organization. It's a unilateral US list of putting in place countries that allegedly are sponsors of terrorism. It is a list that unfortunately has been used not as a tool to fight terrorism, which is a legitimate fight, not as a tool to truly designate countries that are of concern, or real concern, because they could be a threat of terrorism. It is a tool that has traditionally been used to try to punish and denigrate other countries. There is no reason whatsoever why Cuba should be in that list. And it was put in January of 2021, as in the last days of the government of Donald Trump, the Republican government in the United States, as a measure to punish Cuba. No, I have spoken with no one in Washington. They can honestly say that they believe that Cuba sponsors terrorism. And there's no indication. If one looks at the reasons claimed to put Cuba in the list, none of them can sustain a test of the truth or a check of facts. Cuba is truly a country that has been a victim of terrorism. So it is remarkable that the US can claim to do this. Now, the problem with this list is not only that it is slander and it tries to discredit Cuba, it has an immense economic impact on Cuba, because international financial institutions, international corporations, both private and state-owned in many parts of the world, fear the impact or the cost that they could have if they involve in a country that falls within that list. The overwhelming power and influence, above all in financial influence, of the United States in many parts of the world implies that countries are cautious in trying to deal with a country that's in that list. And to give you an idea, in the first 30 to 40 days of Cuba having been included in that list, over 30 financial institutions and banks around the world severed their relationship with Cuba. They said, look, we understand you're not a country of sponsor of terrorism. We have no problems with you. We're interested in business, but we fear we might suffer consequences if we continue to deal with you because you are in that list. And that is the impact of that list.
Ambassador Cossio, in one of the questions that was posed to you was mentioned the relationship with Congress people that are from the Republican Party. We know that recently there was a fair in Cuba for American farmers, and there was a conversation that included President Miguel Díaz-Canel. Can you talk a little about what happened there and what is the state of the situation of possible food sales to Cuba by those states in the Midwest that predominantly are represented by Republican in Congress?
Well, the relationship with the agricultural sector of the United States and Cuba is not new. And the meeting that took place is the first one after COVID, but it's a continuation of previous meetings that had taken place in the business sector with interest in Cuba. Cuba is a country that is an importer of food. We produce part of what we need, but we are an import. In the difference with this meeting is that for the first time, we did not speak only of trade, of buying products in the United States and the possibility of selling some from Cuba to the United States, but we spoke about investment in the agribusiness in Cuba, both in agriculture and in food production. There's some transformations taking place in the Cuban economy, some of them in the agricultural sector with new private companies coming up and small also state-owned companies that have been created, but the majority are not state-owned, they're private or cooperative. And there was a keen interest of the participants from the United States in wanting to involve themselves in this sector with investment, which also includes a level of trade, because when you invest, then you do not only purchase the finished product, but we need seeds, you need fertilizers, you need technology, all of which exist in the United States and from which Cuba could benefit for our own development in terms of food production and agriculture in general. Now, we tend to believe that the agricultural sector is not only Republican. We think that there must be some Democrats there too, and people perhaps from other parties or other political persuasions. But you're right when you say that an important part of them tell us when they do speak about it, that they support the Republican Party, that the area where they live, there's a greater support for the Republican Party. So it serves to show that the links of Cuba with the United States, it's not partisan. We have links with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and again, those that belong to other parties or that belong to no party at all.
On the issue of Cuba on the list of nation sponsors of terrorism, can you tell us about the accusation that Cuba is involved on supporting groups in Colombia, and how, for instance, the Kingdom of Norway, that is the co-guarantor of the peace process with Cuba, has seen those accusations?
The justification or the pretext used to include Cuba in the list in January of 2021 was that there was a presence in Cuba of a delegation of the ELN, which is the National Liberation Army, which is one of the guerrilla groups in Colombia. ELN had begun peace talks in Ecuador with the government of Colombia, of which Cuba was one of the co-guarantors together with Norway. At some point, the government of Ecuador decided that it did not want to host those talks anymore. So the government of Colombia requested Cuba formally in a written document for Cuba to house or to host these talks. And for that we needed to have in our country and sustain in our country the delegation of the National Liberation Army in Cuba. Cuba accepted, among other reasons, because at the moment the government of Colombia could find no other government ready to host these talks. And we have a history of commitment with peace talks and the peace process in Colombia, not only with the one that took place between 2012 and 2016 with FARC, but in the past, there were other commitments of that type with several Colombian governments of different parties in Colombia. So in response to that tradition and coherent with that tradition, we accepted that formal request from the Colombian government. Then the change of government happened in Colombia, and a new administration came in that was not interested anymore in the peace process, that did not want to continue the talks, even though it did begin communications with the delegation that took place in Cuba, which was not revealed until later because we were asked to keep it discreetly, and we did. It was the government of Colombia that made it public later. When a terrorist attack occurred in Colombia, of which, of course, Cuba and Norway have no responsibility with it, the government of Colombia decided to put an end to all its commitments, and then was demanding Cuba to go back on its word, Cuba to go back on what it had signed formally upon an agreement, upon an appeal by the Colombian government to have the delegation in Cuba, and for us to kick them out of Cuba and to send them away. We could not do that. It was part of our international commitment. And Norway totally agreed with us, and the international community in general agreed with us. Cuba had to fulfill its commitment with what it signed. What credibility would we have in the future to participate in any process if with a change of government we change the commitment that we made? Or what credibility would there be anywhere in the world for any peace process if governments were to change just because of demands when there was a change of guard in the government that made the appeal for the delegation to take place, for the process to take place? Now, that was the excuse used by the government of the United States with the support of the current government of Colombia to put Cuba in that list. It is a totally illegitimate pretext, and it only serves political motivations from Washington.
By the way, it was also rejected by the Kingdom of Norway, that is the other partner in the guarantor role during the conversation. There is another question here. Did you, the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security, make any firm commitment on their side during the conversation or agree to convene another high-level meeting, perhaps with a wider agenda, sometimes in 2022?
No, what we agreed upon basically was on the basic elements of the diagnosis of the problem. We agreed that there was need to have some greater operational communication and cooperation in some of the issues that we dealt with. And of course, there was an understanding that this kind of exercise is useful, that needs to be repeated, but there was no concrete agreement on another meeting or any other high-level talks of this type.
There is another question here. How have economic sanctions affected Cuba's response to COVID-19 domestically and globally? It
has been huge. Sometimes it is portrayed with simplicity, and you cannot understand the economic sanctions with simplicity. To give you an idea, we had problems with the availability of drugs, medicine in general, for the pandemic and for other chronic diseases at that moment in which we had a strict financial situation because of the pandemic and because of the economic blockade. Now, Cuba, the US government will be responsible. If you ask us, we'll give a license and we'll sell you drugs. That is not the answer to the issue. Cuba produces more than 80% of the drugs that are used by the population. But those drugs need to be produced in the country, many of which depend on raw material purchased in other markets. When you have a moment in which you have been sanctioned financially, when the international institutions or the financial institutions of other countries that you use for your commercial activity, all of a sudden interrupt their transactions, then you have obstacles and you have interruption in the process of trade. When some of the companies that supply the raw materials that you need to produce drugs, all of a sudden say that they can't continue their relationship with Cuba because Cuba is, for example, in the list of the state sponsors of terrorism, or some of the companies that were doing the purchasing are in a special restricted list of the State Department or the Department of Treasury, then that interrupts the process of acquiring medicine. And that's one of the problems that we faced. At one point, we had limitations for oxygen in Cuba. And it was difficult to purchase it anywhere in the region. We tried to explore purchasing oxygen in the United States. And we found that you need a license. So when you need a license to purchase oxygen, to purchase water, to purchase medicine, it means that by definition, exporting water, oxygen, or medicine to Cuba are prohibited. And that is a reality we face today, as it is prohibited for an American to travel to Cuba. For an American to travel to Cuba, he needs to request a permission from its government or an individual or a general permission to export water, to export oxygen, which was highly needed in the months of July and August in Cuba. You needed permission. Fortunately, we were able to solve it with the help of other nations that were able to in a timely fashion, help Cuba to solve the problem of oxygen we had at the time. And of course, Since then, we've made the required investment and there's no need for us to purchase oxygen anywhere in the world anymore. But that's the kind of problems that we face specifically during COVID. We offered the United States to cooperate. We said, let's exchange information. We have useful experience that you can use, and you have useful information that we could use, and technology. Why can't we cooperate for the benefit of both our countries and for the benefit of the region? I am sure that if from the early stages of COVID, Cuba and the United States would have joined forces, we could have made an important contribution to our region after such a huge challenge to mankind in general.
Let me add 2 questions on this issue that perhaps you can expand. At the end of the Obama administration, the US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, mentioned cooperation on international health between Cuba and the United States as an example of cooperation that the 2 countries, despite their differences, could have. Today, Ambassador Powell is the director of the USAID, that we know is an organization that is involved in several programs associated with the regime change goals proclaimed in the Helms-Burton bill. Is Cuba ready to cooperate with the USAID internationally or bilaterally in areas of international health?
Yes, we're ready. We've explored that several times in the past, and we are ready to help other countries. But the remarkable thing of the story you're mentioning is that at the time when those comments were made, Cuba was being celebrated by the US government, by the Secretary General of the UN, by the Director General of WHO, by PAHO, by everybody, by people all over the world, because of Cuba's important contribution to healthcare in most countries of the third world. Our doctors, the training in Cuba of doctors, of thousands of doctors of many countries around the world, that was praised. And it was logical to be praised because the impact of Cuba's cooperation had an influence in saving lives in many countries, in providing for the first time medical services to populations that live in depressed conditions and had never ever had medical services, and that their governments wanted to provide them, did not know how, so then appealed to Cuba so that we could help. That was the situation and it was praised as it should be. It has been traditionally praised by the UN. The Trump administration chose to change the narrative and to say that these Cubans are slaves and that Cuba is practicing human trafficking. That narrative is not repeated anymore, but the policy is still in place. It's a policy that aims to deprive millions of people in Latin America, in Africa, and in other parts of the world of medical services that were provided thanks to the participation of Cuban technical personnel, medical personnel, and these countries suffer being accused of participating in human trafficking because the United States simply chose to define it that way. It's a type of narrative supported by millions and millions of dollars of propaganda to try to discredit Cuba and to damage the Cuban society and the Cuban nation as a whole.
On Monday, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, denounced the exclusion of Cuba from the Summit of the Americas. It is clear that under the auspice of PAHO, there is a negotiation or a conversation about a hemispheric healthcare compact. Well, the question will be, what can Cuba contribute to this discussion, of which it has been excluded, allegedly, according to the Minister of Foreign Relations of Cuba?
Well, Cuba has already contributed more than any other country in the hemisphere in providing healthcare and saving lives in our region as a whole. So the contribution can be significant. We have the experience. We've been there. We've been in the communities. In many countries, almost all countries, almost every country in the region, we've trained many of the doctors that perform in those countries. So we have a record of experience that can be helpful if you're going to talk about a general scheme for the region. Now, if you're going to leave that only in the hands of the multinational corporations that control the production of drugs, that control the insurance companies, and that control the medical organizations that profit from healthcare, which is a human right, then it's not going to be anything solving the problems of the region. It will not be helpful to the communities that do not have access to healthcare. And I'm talking about millions of people in this hemisphere. So we believe that Cuba's contribution, without impositions, without wanting to be a protagonist, but Cuba's contribution, and above all, Cuba's experience, would be helpful in putting together a plan if the aim is truly to benefit the people of the hemisphere.
I just wanted to take notice that we have by now 26 participants in our conversation. There is another question. The Biden administration seems to be capitulating to the Republican Party in South Florida over and over again. The Democrats do not seem poised to take Florida back in any foreseeable future or upcoming election. What can Democrats who want to continue to push for engagement and the improvement of bilateral relations specifically do to encourage the party who are the Democrats who are more willing to capitulate to Republicans to push the Biden administration to engage? In short, what might we do to get more Democrats on the side of engagement? I don't know if, well...
That issue falls into domestic policy of the United States. I don't want to get into that. What I can say is the following. For us, perhaps we could be mistaken, but US policy towards Cuba or US policy towards any country should follow the interest of the US as a nation, the national interest as a whole. It should not be limited or strictly tied to electoral politics or electoral ambitions. That is what one would expect. It is difficult for Cuba or for any country to try to engage with the United States, having to follow the domestic realities and electoral ambitions on one state or one region in the country. And it is a pity that the policy is openly portrayed in that fashion. It is a pity that policy is made because of fear of political electoral costs, or is portrayed in order not to insult the perception that exists in one region of the country, even knowing that that perception is far from the facts, is far from reality.
Well, two things to add into this question. The first one is that this is the Madison Doctrine about how the political system of the United States was created, precisely to avoid the representation of narrow interests above the national interest of the United States. So your regret is in some sense very American in the sense that the way it is designed. And I want to share the information that some months ago, 114 members of Congress of the Democratic Party, meaning the majority of the Democrats in the House, they wrote a letter to President Biden asking for a change in the policy towards Cuba. So there are, I think that this letter provides some important cues of policies that can be pushed for and represent better not only the Democratic Party, but as the ambassador reminds us, the national interest of the United States. And thank you for that. As an American, I'm a Cuban, but I'm also an American. And as an American, I thank you for reminding us about that. So let me ask you, there is also on the issue of Cuba, there were other areas of law enforcement, of rescue in the high seas and things like that, that were left without continuation by the Trump administration. Is there any disposition that you notice in Washington or that you bring from Cuba to reconnect on these areas?
There were agreements signed, relevant agreements, I would say, in areas that are and should be of mutual interest. For example, communication and cooperation to fight terrorism, communication and cooperation to fight drug trafficking, organized crime, human trafficking, counterfeit, issues on cybersecurity. All of those agreements one would think are of logical interest to the United States, and they are, I can assure you, of interest to Cuba. It is logical for us to engage. We engage with other countries in the region, and I think that it would be in the national interest of the United States, as is in the national interest of Cuba, to try to cooperate. None of this solves our political problems. None of this solves the discrepancy that we could have, but we should not allow ideological differences for us to stop fulfilling our commitments with our own peoples in fighting organized crime, terrorism, drug trafficking, trafficking persons, cyber attacks, etc.
Thank you. There is another area in which we have seen some public opinion and discussion about the convenience or not of retaking the road, or the Obama's road at the end of his term. Some people are claiming that after July 11, a large group of Cubans has been arrested and there has been long sentences for actions that they took in the protests of this day. There are more and more information about the role of some organizations outside outside Cuba, some of them that receive money from the National Endowment for Democracy and from the USAID that played a role promoting this type of protest. So in some sense, there is a commitment, or some people claim that there is a moral commitment by the United States and these organizations to a solution to the problem that they are in jail with these long sentences. Is there any possibility that an improvement of relations create an atmosphere in which the Cuban government can exercise some kind of amnesty or solution to this situation that I understand that are part of the legal system of Cuba?
Well, we have a long-standing position, and we've said that many times, and we said it during the Obama years, and we repeated that with the United States, we are ready to discuss any issue, that nothing is out of the table if we're going to bilaterally discuss. But on the issue that you're mentioning, there's already, unfortunately, a very well-established narrative that comes all from the same source, that repeats several ideas constantly and by many, many people without facts being checked. It all comes from the same source. To give you an example, they say that thousands of people went out in the street in Cuba to protest peacefully on July 11th. If thousands of people went out to protest peacefully and a few hundred were detained and prosecuted, how can you claim that people were jailed or repressed for peacefully protesting? What happened to the other 9, 10, 14,000 that protested and never went to jail, were never visited by police, were never even questioned? The people that were questioned, the people that were detained, and the people that are being prosecuted are the people that broke the law in Cuba. To attack or to attempt to attack a police station in Cuba, it's against the law. To burn a vehicle, a civilian vehicle, or a police car, it's illegal. In Cuba, it's against the law, and you have to respond for that.
It is
to vandalize shops, private shops and state-owned shops, commercial shops, it's illegal in Cuba. To steal products and items from vandalized shops, it's illegal in Cuba. To throw rocks, to damage people, to physically damage people and attack people is illegal in Cuba. And the people who participate in that have to respond in the law. But I'll go beyond. To receive orientation from abroad, on the phone, from the territory of the United States, to vandalize on the basis of promises of payment, or the promises of being given a visa to migrate to the United States, is against the law in Cuba, and the people who participate have to respond to the authorities. And that is what has happened in Cuba. Of course, there's a long legend that people are being punished for protesting. Well, how about the 10,000, 9,000, whatever the figure? I don't know the figure. People mention many figures. And some people mention 48 communities where there were peaceful protests. What happened to the rest? They have not seen a policeman. They have not seen the inside of a police station. So they protested peacefully and they were left alone because they did not act against the law. Those that did, the few hundred, have to face the authorities and the established law in Cuba that cannot be changed. There's a narrative, and it's important to talk about children being incarcerated in Cuba. No child was incarcerated in Cuba. According to Cuba's law, people 17 and over are responsible for criminal law, as in many other countries in the world. In the United States, someone of the age of 12 could be responsible and be penalized as an adult when he violates the law. In the case of Cuba, there's a difference between 17 and 20 years old. There's a special dispensation and they receive a treatment totally different from anyone over 20 years of age. That does not exist in the United States. Then comes a problem or the issue of the sanctions. You could have the opinion that the sanctions were severe. I can, or exaggerated, some people say. I can respect that opinion, but it is an opinion. It is not the law. The law, these people were punished according, or the sentence that have been proposed, because none of them has been ratified yet. The sentence that have been proposed were sentenced according to what is established in the law in Cuba. And one could disagree, as I could disagree of giving life sentence to someone in Cuba who's 17 years of age, or giving the death penalty to someone in the United States who is 17 years of age. Or I could disagree with many of the punishments given in the United States or in Europe or in Latin America for many issues. But none of that occurred in Cuba, as nobody in Cuba during those processes lost their eyes, as has happened in many countries in Latin America. And no massacre occurred in Cuba, no disappearance occurred in Cuba, as does happen in many other countries that are allies, intimate allies of the United States in our region. So the narrative serves a political purpose. It was fed by powerful groups in Southern Miami, and it was also fed by the US government as a matter of convenience to continue to remain and to continue to apply the policy that was put in place by Donald Trump. That is the reality that we face today.
No, and please also let me remind the audience that there is a history in which issues of prisoners that has been judged and sentenced according to the Cuban laws, their situation has been improved, not with policies of hostility and isolation, but the record with the Carter administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration is that the discussion of the issue and the conversation within Cuban society has been wider and more flexible in situations in which the relationship between Cuba and the United States has improved. There is a final question. I think that it should be the final according to the time that I was given for this conversation, but feel free if you want to say something extra. There is a question that said, what level of engagement with Cuba from US healthcare, scientific, and biotech companies have existed since Biden took office? For example, President Diaz-Canel recently met with the president of Operation Walk, and 2 Nobel Prize winning scientists from the US are presenting this week at the 2022 Bio-Havana inaugural conference.
There has been some exchange. I would say not much. And I would say far from what could be occurring and the potential that exists, and far from the interest that exists both in Cuba and the United States within the scientific community in the specific area of health for further engagement. It is surprising that that does not occur, again, after suffering such a severe pandemic that has damaged the whole world and humanity as a whole. We hope that one way or the other in the future, with the support of the US government, or in spite of the obstacle posed by the US government, that we can continue to engage and expand our communication with the health and scientific community in the United States for peaceful purposes, for purpose of improving the lives of people, for purpose of engaging and advancing the area of science and health that is so necessary for everybody.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cossio. Those are the questions that I saw, plus some that I add. I want to call Natasha Bagnan from ACERE, the organization that is sponsoring this brief, and ask her if she wants to add something. It has been a great pleasure again.
It's a pleasure for me
to be a moderator in this debate and have in this conversation. And I'm glad that you were able to answer most of the questions that were posed we have a high number of 28 at some point. So Natasha, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Arturo. Thank you, Deputy Foreign Minister, for your time this morning and answering a number of questions that you can see really range across a very broad spectrum of issues that people are interested in and curious about. How can we better promote positive, encouraging bilateral relations with our closest neighbor to the South and the Caribbean? And for congressional offices that are still joining us, you'll see in the chat that there's a number of bills that, if you're not already familiar with them or the co-leads on those bills, that you can look into and see how your offices can support, that are encouraging and supporting closer bilateral relations, including on issues like trade. The letter that was posted, also signed by 114 members of Congress, that was sent just a few months ago to the Biden administration. Those members have yet to receive a response from the administration, but request things that you heard the Deputy Foreign Minister talk about today. Issues around removing Cuba from the state sponsors list of terrorism, reestablishing remittances, closer communication and collaboration on issues of public health and humanitarian assistance, particularly as many countries continue to be ravaged by the pandemic. There's a lot of issues of mutual collaboration and cooperation that could be encouraged during this time, where we really are seeing that being promoted in the world, and yet we haven't had that for several years now with Cuba. If your offices are interested in learning how you could support or lead or co-lead resolutions, bills, amendments, appropriations processes related to any of these issues, or how to further promote closer dialogue and exchanges, including on things that are critical like climate justice and climate change, and how we can, in a more collaborative fashion, respond to that with Cuba, then please reach out to us. I'll make sure to drop our contact information in the chat, or reach out to some of the congressional leads who have long been champions on these issues. There's some additional resources in the chat as well for what responsible engagement can look like. There's many, despite what the popular narrative may be, there have long, for years, been many congressional supporters and allies and leads that continue to demand for a different policy response and relationship with Cuba, for the benefit not only of US residents and citizens, but for Cubans as well. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Deputy Foreign Minister. Thank you, Arturo, and we hope to be in touch soon. Gracias.
Bye.